Chapter 24 of Ester Ried's Namesake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried's Namesake by Pansy. Chapter 24. Homeward Bound. Mrs. Randall was at her toilet stand in the act of pouring water into the basin. She turned quickly from her husband as he entered, but not quickly enough to prevent his catching the glitter of tears on her face, and the sight of one or two plashing into the water. This was the explanation of his dismayed "Why, Helen!" To see his wife in tears was a sight for Spencer Randall to remember. He went over to her, speaking gently, touching with tender fingers the little rings of hair that had escaped from their confining pins. "Helen, dear wife, what is it? What has happened to hurt you? Ester was so merry that I thought everything was well." "Everything is." She dashed the water over her flushed face and tried to speak in her usual tone. "Nothing has happened, Spencer, really. I was warm and tired and a little bit foolish, that is all." He searched her face in perplexed sympathy, and then, slowly, as men take in such things, came a gleam of intelligence. He drew the face all dripping with water close to his and kissed it again and again, half whimsical, wholly tender kisses. "Did she think," he said, between the kisses, "that her husband had turned into a thoughtless, selfish clod who meant to go off and flock by himself, leaving his wife and child to brave it out alone? That isn't true, dear. I'm not going a step, not a single step." "Spencer, let me go." His wife was struggling to free herself from his hold. She was laughing, yet her eyes were still suspiciously veiled. "I am a complete idiot this morning. I don't know what to make of myself, only it is warm, warmer than usual, and I got overtired at the ironing." "It isn't because you are to go, Spencer. You don't think so meanly of me as that. I know you don't. It's just that it came to me so suddenly how long it was since I had seen mother, and how many times she had planned and been disappointed. It just broke me down for a minute. But I'm all over it now, and you needn't ever think of it again." "I'm a brute," said the Reverend Spencer Randall, penitently. "That is just what I am. I don't know how I came to yield to the thought, even for an hour. I must have got carried off my balance for a little while, over mother and the girls. But I won't go, of course I won't. I'll write to Dr. Wheeler this very evening and tell him so. It won't make any trouble, there's an alternate who is just suffering to be in my shoes, and he can have them. It wouldn't be any pleasure for me to go East and leave you and Ester out here alone. It seems ridiculous that I entertained the idea for a moment." "Spencer Randall, you will kill me if you don't stop talking in that way. I wouldn't have you give it up for anything in this world. Why, it is the next best thing to going myself, to think of you seeing mother and Mary face to face, and telling them all about Ester, and everything. I'm just as glad as I can be over the thought of it. Why, to have mother come so near to a visit from you as that, and then have to give it up, after all she has borne, would be too cruel. You couldn't do it. Oh, Spencer, I forgot. You mustn't put on your garden clothes. You will have to go out to the Johnson place right after dinner. Poor old Mrs. Johnson is almost home. They sent for you twice yesterday, and this morning John said it seemed as though she was just waiting to tell you good bye." At that moment the voice of Ester sounded from the foot of the stairs. "Father, are you sure you are hurrying? I do believe you are wasting your time making love to mother, and those potatoes are done." All through the dinner, and until he was fairly started for his 8-mile ride to the Johnson place, Mr. Randall protested that he could not think of filling his appointment. The more he considered it, the more he was sure he did not want to go, not until he could take them both with him. That might happen in another year, who could tell? Anyway, he simply could not go without them. He had been dazed. It had seemed to him all the time that of course they were going too. And when it suddenly came over him that this thing was to be done alone, leaving the best 2/3 of him behind, why, it was preposterous. He went away reiterating this, and all the way to the Johnson place, while his stout pony picked out carefully the least objectionable portions of the ugly road, his rider kept assuring himself that it had been cruel even to mention it. He ought to have spared Helen that; and as for going, no indeed! Nothing that Helen or Ester could say should make him change his mind. When he rode home from the Johnson place in the dusk of the fast gathering night, even the journey to the East had slipped into the background. He had been waiting at the place where two worlds meet. He had gone with the worn out mother to the very verge of this one, and held her hand and offered a prayer, just as the door had opened and her soul had slipped away to God. It was true that she seemed to have waited only to bid her faithful minister good bye. Her last words to him had been pleasant ones to remember. "Good bye, pastor, good bye. I shall tell them all in heaven, and him first of all, that I wouldn't have got there if it hadn't been for you." Poor old Mother Johnson! She had been one of those who all through the earlier years had been planning each season to go "home" to Vermont, and the plans had miscarried, and the way grown heavier and more doubtful with each passing year; and the woman had grown discouraged and hard and bitter, and given up her hope not only of the earthly home but of the heavenly; and then, one day, Pastor Randall had found her, away off in another township, unknown to his church or people. He had found her and reached her and won her for his Master; and her later years had been bright with his presence; and on her rugged old face had glowed at last the anticipation of her sure home going, that no blighted harvests could arrest. As the missionary trotted through the bridle path between the wide stretches of fields, he told himself that heaven was as near to them there as it was in the old Eastern homes, and that, after all, it was the home to think about and look forward to. And there were compensations along the way. Suppose he had been East when the summons came for Mother Johnson! He wouldn't have missed her good bye for a great deal. But his wife and daughter meant that he should go East and visit the two mothers. Given two such women as Mrs. Randall and her daughter Ester, it seems hardly necessary to add that they accomplished their purpose, though not, it is true, without many perplexities and some misgivings. All the while the father was waiting in the Johnson cabin to close the doors of this world after the departing mother, his wife and daughter were holding a council of ways and means. "His best suit looks pretty well," said the mother. "That coat in the spring box came just in time, and it fits him better than they do generally. I can never feel thankful enough that it didn't fit the man for whom it was made, and that he was moved to put it into our box." "I don't think it fits any too well," Ester said. "If the man for whom it was made had been content with a cheaper one, and put the difference into the collection for home missions, he and father might both have had coats that fitted them. That would be the truest economy, mother, as well as the pleasantest way for missionaries." "It does very well," said her mother, who had returned to her usual state of calm energy. "I wish I could say the same for his shirts. I confess that I don't know how to manage about them. I was hoping that Sarah—well, never mind that. I had set my heart on 2 new shirts in that last box, and you know there wasn't one. The old ones are too much worn to patch any longer; the cloth has got so that it will not hold the stitches." Ester laughed absently as she said, "It will not do to set your heart on anything that comes in boxes, mother." She was leaning forward with her elbow resting on her knee, and her chin in her hand, gazing meditatively into the pasteboard box that held the disabled shirts. Suddenly she came to an upright position and clasped her shapely hands. "Mother, I have an idea. Why can't we make father a shirt out of my white petticoat? 2, indeed. If shirts didn't need to have sleeves, I am sure it could be done; and even as it is, we may be able to do it with piecing. Aren't the sleeves of the old shirts pretty good? It is a very wide skirt, and long. As for the bosoms, do you remember that queer, old-fashioned white linen cape that came in the box you had just before I came home, and we wondered what could ever be done with it? Why wouldn't that make bosoms? Mommy, why don't you go into raptures over the thought?" "What a child you are!" said her mother, gazing fondly at her treasure. "But I believe it could be done. I could rip up the oldest of these for a pattern. I am sure it will not stand another washing. But Ester dear, what do you think your father would say? You know he will not have your one white petticoat sacrificed for him." "Sacrificed!" repeated the girl in her gayest tone. "Who thinks of such a thing? Am I not planning for the petticoat to take a trip East and visit all the folks? What better experience than that could it hope for? Mommie, I am ashamed of you. If you don't enter into the spirit of great opportunities any better than that, I may have to marry Deacon Bascom's Jed just to teach you a lesson." It was plain to Ester that she must indulge in a little nonsense, for her mother's lip had quivered over that word "sacrificed." She had her way. The mother reflected tenderly that night, and many times through the following busy days, how sure the child was, sooner or later, to sway them both. What a blessed thing it was that her ways were always sweet and unselfish and pure, for certainly it would be hard to withstand her. The Reverend Spencer Randall thought it all over as he sat on the eastbound express, moving at the rate of 30 miles an hour. In the worn valise at his feet reposed 2 new shirts, as carefully made and laundered as skill and love could accomplish. Undoubtedly they were a credit to their makers, and the home missionary knew their history. Ester had earnestly instructed her mother that the source of the material from which they were made must forever remain a secret to her father, and Mrs. Randall had tried to obey. But the father had keen eyes and quick wits, and knew all about his frayed shirt bosoms and the poverty of the family purse. His questions grew too close for truth-loving lips, and the story of the shirts evolved little by little. The father's eyes grew misty and his expression tender and wistful as he looked down at the valise and thought not only of the new shirts, but of the many things connected with the getting ready for this wonderful trip. Almost to the last he had steadily persisted that he was not going home until he could take wife and daughter with him. But the wife and daughter had known how to manage him. Much talk was made before him about the joy his coming would make in Mrs. Randall's own home. She explained, to Ester of course, how fully she had written to Mother and Mary about the plans, and she knew how to bring in, at just the right moment, the eager hope that nothing would occur to disappoint Mother again. "It seems as though I could not bear it if she had to give this up, too," she said. As for Ester, with each new morning she had thought of some new way in which this trip of father's was to be of immense advantage to those who stayed behind. Gradually the meshes of the loving spell they were weaving gathered close about him and made him feel that somehow it was becoming his duty to sacrifice himself and take that long-deferred journey for the sake of his family. There had been no tears visible on his wife's face since that first day. Instead, she had lived apparently for the sole purpose of getting him well started. They watched him away, mother and daughter, with brave, smile-wreathed faces, and kisses blown after him as far down the road as his straining, backward-looking eyes could see. And so, at last he was going home. Thought was very busy that morning. It was not possible to keep from reverting to the times without number in which plans for this very journey had been made, and lived on for months, and relinquished. Nor had the Eastern homes been without their plans. Mrs. Randall, besides her sister Mary, had 2 brothers, older than herself, who had struggled all their lives against the disadvantages of having passed their youth and early manhood in luxury, and in the belief that there would be always a wealthy father to back them. They had never been financial successes, and now, in middle life, had large families and small salaries. On Mr. Randall's side there were 2 maiden sisters living with his widowed mother. He always spoke of them as "the girls," never being able to realize that during the quarter century of separation they had grown into more than middle-aged women. All these people had remembered their missionary brother and sister with frequent letters and such Christmas and birthday tokens as they could afford, and at their family reunions had told one another hopefully that by next year they thought they could make up a purse between them and send for "Helen and Spencer and the child" to make a long visit. The 2 mothers, in particular, had been long fed on these hopes that blossomed each Christmas and were blighted by necessities before the new year reached its springtime. Later had come somewhat anxious plans for the child, which was the way in which they had always spoken of Ester Randall. None of them had traveled much, and "out west" was to them a vast, howling wilderness, peopled chiefly by Indians and half breeds; no place certainly in which to bring up a child, especially a girl; and they met and planned and were perplexed over difficulties, and made their various sacrifices, and at last arranged that the child should be sent to them for a term of years to be educated, they to assume all responsibility for her maintenance while she was with them. And they were wholly astonished and half offended when Helen with singular blindness refused to give up the child for even a year. They had ceased to urge this after a while, but their anxieties had not lessened, and they hinted in their letters so much about the contrast that there must some day be between their favored children and the unfortunate Ester, that the mother, half amused and half vexed, ceased telling in her letters about Ester's accomplishments or virtues. "They think she is half a savage," she said to her husband, "and that we, apparently, have also become uncivilized. I presume they think we eat with our fingers, and have forgotten the use of napkins. Let them think so. I shall not try to enlighten them any more. Some day, when we take Ester home, they will make discoveries." CHAPTER 25.